The air in Jerusalem was thick with silence, the kind that comes not from peace but from uncertainty. Clouds hung low over the city like a heavy blanket, dulling the light of day, and with it, the hearts of the people. The great king Uzziah was dead. His reign had been long and for the most part prosperous, but now his throne sat empty, and fear crept into the minds of those who had once felt secure under his rule. Isaiah walked slowly through the outer courts of the temple, his sandals brushing against the worn stone with each step. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing on his chest. The streets were quieter these days. Conversations were whispered, merchants were cautious, and even the laughter of children had dimmed into a rare and fleeting sound. Something in the nation had shifted, and not just politically. For years, Isaiah had watched his people drift. They still offered sacrifices, still burned incense and kept the festivals, but their hearts were no longer in it. Their worship had become mechanical, their faith hollow. Injustice reigned in the courts, the poor were forgotten, and greed had slithered its way into every corner of society. It was as if the soul of Judah was asleep, numbed by routine, dulled by comfort, and blinded by pride. He remembered the king's final days. Uzziah had started well, a man who feared the Lord and brought reforms to the land. But power had intoxicated him. Against the law of God, he had entered the temple to burn incense like a priest, and in his arrogance, he was struck with leprosy. Isaiah had been there. He had seen the fear in the king's eyes as the white blotches spread across his skin. He had heard the gasps of the priests, the chaos of rushed footsteps. It was a day Isaiah would never forget, a warning etched into memory. Now Judah stood at a crossroads. Would they return to the Lord or keep drifting into darkness? Isaiah wasn't a leader, at least not in the eyes of the people. He wasn't a king nor a priest. He was a man of words, of observation, a man who listened more than he spoke. But even silence can stir when the world feels like it's unraveling. And lately, his heart had been restless. He paused at the edge of the inner court, letting his fingers graze the cold stone wall. From this angle, he could see the massive bronze altar and the faint traces of smoke still rising from the morning sacrifice. The scent of burnt flesh lingered in the air, a daily reminder of sin and its cost. Isaiah turned his gaze upward. The sky was the same grey as it had been for weeks, and yet something in him whispered that change was coming. Not political change, not a new king with a new agenda, but something deeper, something divine. He closed his eyes. "Lord," he murmured under his breath, "if you are still speaking, speak to me." The words felt too bold, even as they left his lips. Who was he to ask anything of the Almighty? He was just one man in a city filled with voices, most of them louder and more important than his, and yet the ache in his chest would not fade. He carried it with him through the markets, through the temple gates, even in the stillness of his own home. It wasn't fear, it wasn't grief. It was something else, a strange combination of burden and calling, like being drawn towards something he could not yet name. Later that evening, Isaiah stood on the rooftop of his dwelling. The city stretched before him in shadows and fading light. Lanterns flickered in the windows below, and a cold breeze whispered over the rooftops, stirring his robe. He thought about his people, about their blindness, their hardness of heart. He thought about how many times he had felt the urge to speak, to cry out against the injustice he saw, but had silenced himself out of fear or doubt. What difference could one voice make, anyway? But still, that whisper stirred. Maybe, he thought, this emptiness I feel isn't emptiness at all. Maybe it's space being made for something greater. He took a slow breath. Something was coming. He could feel it, not in his mind, but in his spirit. And deep down Isaiah knew the silence would not last forever. The days that followed felt longer than usual. The city continued its slow rhythm. Merchants opened their stalls at dawn. The temple gates welcomed the devout and the routine, and life moved forward, even if no one seemed entirely sure in which direction. Isaiah moved through it all like a man wrapped in invisible fog. People greeted him, asked about his family, his health, the weather, but he barely registered the words. His answers came automatically, but his thoughts were always elsewhere, circling something he couldn't quite grasp. There was an ache inside him, not the kind caused by physical pain or even grief. It was deeper than that, like a silent void that had been carved out in his chest, and now echoed with questions he couldn't silence. He began to wander more often, slipping through alleys and courtyards, seeking quiet places in a city that rarely stopped. He watched people when they weren't performing, mothers coaxing tired children, men trading goods with hardened expressions, priests going through rituals with eyes that rarely lifted toward heaven. He saw weariness, he saw numbness, and it mirrored his own. One morning, Isaiah found himself at the edge of the city, standing before a vineyard he used to visit as a boy. The land was dry now. The vines, once full of life, had withered. The stone walls were crumbling, and the ground was cracked with neglect. He stood there for a long time, watching the wind stir the dust. Something about it felt symbolic, though he didn't yet know why. He sat on a nearby rock, staring out at the broken vineyard. "Is this what we've become?" he whispered. "A once fruitful land, now abandoned." The thought unsettled him. He reached for understanding, but the silence only deepened the hollow within. The ache was growing, not painful but pressing, persistent, like a question that refused to be ignored. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay on his mat, eyes fixed on the ceiling beams of his home, tracing the familiar cracks in the wood. His mind raced. What was this restlessness? Why did he feel like he was being drawn toward something, and yet given no direction? He sat up suddenly. "Why me?" he asked the room, his voice low but sharp. He wasn't special. He wasn't powerful. He didn't come from a long line of prophets or priests. His hands had written more scrolls than they had lifted swords. He was observant, yes, but that didn't make him worthy. Still, the feeling didn't go away. It came with him into his dreams, strange images of fire and wind, of voices calling from far away. It met him in the quiet corners of the temple, when he stood near the altar and felt a presence just beyond the veil of the visible. One afternoon he visited a familiar street where an old teacher used to gather young men for reading and discussion. The teacher was gone now, the house shuttered. But Isaiah remembered the words once spoken there, words from the sacred scrolls. He spoke them aloud, half to himself, half to the wind. "You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart." Was that what this was? A search? Was he finally seeking something that had always been waiting for him? He leaned against the stone wall and let his eyes close. "Then I'm seeking," he whispered. "I don't know what you want from me, Lord. I don't know why you've stirred this in me, but I'm listening, even if I don't know how." The moment passed without a thunderclap, without a vision, without a voice. Just the soft wind and the creaking of wood in the distance. And yet, something shifted. Not in the world around him, but in the hollow inside his chest. It didn't close, it didn't vanish, but it no longer felt empty. It felt expectant, like a womb before birth, like the stillness before a storm, like the air right before something holy breaks through. Isaiah stood, brushed dust from his robe, and walked home in silence. He didn't have answers, but he had a sense, a whisper on the edge of his spirit, that something was coming. And this time, he wouldn't run from it. It was early morning when Isaiah entered the temple again. The city outside was beginning to wake, the sounds of life slowly rising from the cobbled streets. But within the temple courts, all was still. The great stone pillars cast long shadows across the floor, and the air carried the scent of incense, soft and lingering. He wasn't there out of ritual. This time, he came with purpose, though he couldn't name it, not fully. Something within had drawn him here, stronger than before, and he had learned not to ignore it. The inner court was empty. A priest passed by in silence, giving a brief nod of acknowledgement, but Isaiah barely noticed. His eyes were fixed ahead, on the entrance to the sanctuary. He stepped forward. Every sound felt louder here, the brush of his robe, the thud of his sandals against stone. He moved past the altar, where fresh ashes from the morning sacrifice still smoked faintly, and knelt on the cool ground. He closed his eyes. He didn't speak. There were no more questions, no more demands, only stillness. And then, everything changed. The space around him seemed to shift, the silence deepening into something vast, something alive. A wind stirred that had no source. The air itself felt charged, vibrating with power. Isaiah opened his eyes, and he saw. The roof of the temple faded into nothing, and above him was not sky but glory. An endless throne, high and lifted up, shining with a brilliance that words could never fully describe. There was no sun, no moon, only light, radiating from the one seated upon it. His robe filled the space, cascading like waves of fire and gold, reaching even to where Isaiah knelt. Around the throne hovered seraphim, creatures of flame and flight, unlike anything Isaiah had ever imagined. Each had 6 wings. With 2 they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. Their voices rang out, not in soft song, but in thunderous, echoing praise. "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts," they cried. "The whole earth is full of his glory." The temple trembled at their voices. The foundations shook beneath Isaiah's knees, and smoke filled the space, curling around him like a living presence. The awe, the majesty, the sheer weight of what he saw, it stole the breath from his lungs. He couldn't move, he couldn't speak. Every part of him knew, in that moment, he was standing before the holy. And then came the fear. Not the fear of harm, but the fear of unworthiness, of being seen too clearly, known too deeply. In the blinding light of God's presence, there was no hiding, no pretending. Isaiah's voice broke from his throat in a gasp. "Woe to me," he cried. "I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." He fell forward, forehead to the ground, trembling. The holiness of the moment pressed down like a mountain on his shoulders. He didn't belong here, not in this glory, not with a heart like his. And yet, mercy came. One of the seraphim flew toward him, holding a live coal with tongs taken from the altar. It glowed with divine fire, yet did not consume the angel's hands. Isaiah flinched, expecting pain. The coal touched his lips. A single moment. But it changed everything. "See," the seraph said, "this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for." There was no burn, no scar, only silence, a holy silence. Isaiah lifted his head. The fear was still there, but it had been reshaped into reverence. The unworthiness remained, but so did a strange, deep peace. The hollow in his chest was gone. In its place was something stronger, firmer, a quiet certainty as if a seed had just been planted in the soil of his soul. Then came the voice, not from the seraphim, not from the heavens, but from the throne itself. A voice like thunder, yet gentler than wind. It did not shout, it invited. "Whom shall I send?" the voice asked. "And who will go for us?" The words echoed, not just in the temple, but inside Isaiah's very being. They pulsed through his spirit, stirring something deeper than fear, deeper than awe. It was a call, and in the silence that followed, Isaiah felt the entire universe waiting. He looked up. He could barely speak, but his heart moved before his mouth did. And when he opened his lips, the words came not from pride nor from confidence, but from surrender. "Here I am," he said. "Send me." The moment lingered in sacred stillness, and then, without warning, the vision faded. The light withdrew. The smoke lifted. The walls of the temple returned solid and familiar. The world became ordinary again. But Isaiah was no longer the same. The silence that followed the vision wasn't empty. It was holy. It wrapped around Isaiah like a mantle, both weighty and comforting. He remained kneeling on the temple floor, unsure how much time had passed. The light was dimmer now, the smoke gone, and the stillness had returned to the sanctuary, but within him, everything had changed. His heart beat differently. His lungs pulled air as if they had never truly breathed before. And yet underneath the wonder, a trembling still lingered. The echo of what he had seen was too great to simply vanish. He had stood in the presence of the Almighty. He had witnessed the throne of heaven, and in the face of that glory, all his self-image had been stripped away. He could still hear his own cry, "Woe to me," ringing in his mind. Those words hadn't been crafted. They had erupted. The moment his eyes beheld the Lord in all his holiness, there had been no hiding from truth, no rationalizing, no defending, only raw, soul-deep exposure. Isaiah thought he had understood what it meant to be unclean. He had seen the hypocrisy of his people, the shallow rituals, the injustice veiled in civility. But in that moment before God, he saw clearly that he was no better. His lips, tools of a writer, a thinker, a man of words, were stained, not with blood, but with pride, with fear, with silence in moments that demanded courage, with cleverness used to impress rather than to reveal truth. He had used words like weapons and like shields, but rarely like mirrors. And yet, God had touched those lips. He reached up now, instinctively, pressing his fingers gently to his mouth. It didn't hurt. There was no mark. But he remembered the touch, how the coal had cleansed rather than burned, how mercy had followed confession, how holiness had not consumed him, but transformed him. The contradiction filled him with awe. Who was he that the Lord would purify rather than punish, that a man so flawed could be called, could be sent? Still kneeling, Isaiah felt tears well in his eyes, not from shame, but from something deeper. Gratitude, wonder, reverence that reached into the marrow of his bones. He stood slowly, legs trembling beneath him. The temple around him looked the same, but it wasn't. He wasn't. The space felt sacred in a way he had never known before, even after all his years visiting this very court. Every shadow now held mystery. Every stone whispered of purpose. Every echo felt like a heartbeat of something eternal. Isaiah made his way toward the exit, his steps slow, deliberate. Outside, the sun had risen higher in the sky, casting warm light across the city's walls. Jerusalem bustled as it always did, traders shouting, children laughing, camels groaning under weight. But Isaiah didn't hear it the same way. There was a clarity in him now, a stillness beneath the surface noise of the world, and with that clarity came a realization. He had not just been cleansed, he had been claimed. When God asked, "Whom shall I send?" he hadn't been speaking into the void. He had been speaking to Isaiah's spirit, and Isaiah had answered, "Here I am, send me." He repeated the words silently now, as if testing them again. Send me. It wasn't a statement of confidence. It wasn't even a promise of capability. It was a surrender, a willingness, a heart placed in God's hands without conditions. But as the warmth of that moment settled, another feeling crept in, uncertainty. What now? He had seen the Lord. He had been purified. He had said yes. But to what? He stood at the edge of the temple courtyard, the people of Judah going about their lives beyond its gates. They didn't know what had just happened. They didn't feel the weight of glory he carried in his chest. They were still numb, distracted, hardened. Would they listen to him? Would they care? The old doubt stirred again, like smoke rising from cooled ashes. What difference could one voice make in a nation that no longer listened? Isaiah looked toward the horizon, where the hills of Judah met the sky. "I am undone," he whispered again, not with fear this time, but with awe. To be undone in the presence of God was not to be destroyed. It was to be remade. And though the weight of what lay ahead pressed heavily on his shoulders, He knew he would carry it, because the fire that touched his lips had not only purified him, it had ignited something that would not go out. The words still echoed inside him. "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" They hadn't been loud, not like thunder, not like the voices of the seraphim that had shaken the very foundations of the temple. No, this voice had been quieter, but somehow infinitely more powerful. It had settled into the deepest parts of Isaiah's being, a call not just heard but absorbed. He couldn't forget it if he tried. It lingered in his bones like the embers of the coal that had touched his lips. And then there was his own voice, his answer, a whisper spoken from trembling lips but with the force of surrender behind it. "Here I am. Send me." He had expected perhaps a clear response, a divine declaration, a vision of what would come next, but nothing followed. No instructions carved in fire, no scrolls descending from the heavens. There was only silence again, but it was no longer empty. Now it was filled with meaning. Isaiah spent the next few days in quiet reflection. He avoided the crowds, the markets, even the temple. He walked the edges of the city, tracing the walls, pausing by gardens and dry wells, allowing the stillness to settle over him like a garment. His thoughts stretched far and wide, but always returned to the same question. What did it mean to be sent? He knew deep down that saying yes wasn't the end of the journey. It was the beginning, and beginnings were rarely easy. On the fourth day, as the sky turned the color of soft clay and the first stars blinked into view, Isaiah returned to the temple. He wasn't expecting another vision. He wasn't seeking fire or angels or thrones. He just needed to be near the place where everything had shifted. He sat on the temple steps, watching as priests extinguished the final lamps of the day. Smoke from the evening sacrifice rose into the air, trailing like a ribbon toward the darkening sky. It was then the voice came again, not from the clouds, not from the throne, but from within. Gentle, steady, clear. "Go and tell this people." Isaiah held his breath. "Be ever hearing but never understanding. Be ever seeing but never perceiving." The words were strange, not triumphant, not easy. They carried weight and sorrow. Make the heart of this people calloused, make their ears dull, and close their eyes. Isaiah's brow furrowed. He listened as the rest of the message poured through his spirit like oil through cracked stone. Otherwise they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn and be healed. It didn't make sense, not at first. Wasn't that the point? For them to turn and be healed, to understand, to return to the Lord? He stood, heart racing. "But how long, Lord?" he whispered into the twilight, and the voice answered. "Until the cities lie ruined and without inhabitant, until the houses are left deserted and the fields ruined and ravaged, until the Lord has sent everyone far away and the land is utterly forsaken." Isaiah staggered a little. His mission would not be one of immediate success. His words would not melt hearts overnight. He would not be the hero who turned a nation back in one grand speech. No, his task was harder. He was to speak truth that would be ignored, to cry out in a wilderness of deaf ears and blinded eyes, to plant seeds in soil that would not yield fruit, not for a long, long time. And yet, even here, at the edge of despair, came a glimmer. "But as the terebinth and oak leave stumps when they are cut down, so the holy seed will be the stump in the land." Isaiah closed his eyes. He understood now. He wasn't called to bring the harvest. He was called to sow in a barren field, to leave truth like hidden seeds buried in stubborn ground. Seeds that would survive the fire, seeds that would sleep through exile and ruin, waiting for a season no one could yet see. He opened his eyes and looked out over Jerusalem, the city he loved. Its rooftops glowed orange in the dying light, its people unaware of the sacred conversation still ringing in his soul. He felt the ache rise again, not the hollow from before, but a new kind of burden. This was what it meant to be sent. Not to be famous, not to be praised, but to be faithful. He exhaled slowly. "I will speak," he said aloud, "to the stars, to the silence, to the Lord. Even if they never listen, I will speak." And with that, Isaiah took his first step, not as a bystander, but as a prophet. The next morning the city looked no different. Merchants still set up their stalls before the sun fully rose. The smell of fresh bread and dust filled the air. Donkeys brayed and children laughed, their feet kicking up clouds as they ran through the narrow streets. Life in Jerusalem carried on as though nothing had changed. But Isaiah had changed. He walked among the people with new eyes. Every face he passed, every conversation he overheard, echoed with the heaviness of his calling. They were still blind, still deaf, still moving as if untouched by truth, and yet he had been sent to them. The contradiction pressed against his ribs with every breath. The message God had given him wasn't one of immediate restoration. It wasn't hope wrapped in pleasant words. It was judgment, warning, a truth so sharp it would cut before it could ever heal. Isaiah spent the next days writing. Scroll after scroll, his hands moving steadily, recording what he had heard, what he had seen, what burned in his bones. The words weren't crafted for comfort. They were shaped to awaken, to unsettle. But how do you awaken a people who don't want to open their eyes? He thought again of God's words, "Make their hearts calloused," and the ache returned. Why would God send him with a message that would be ignored? He found himself pacing the rooftop of his home at night, staring at the stars as if they might explain. But the sky offered no answers, only the distant memory of a voice that had already told him all he needed to know. Faithfulness, not success. Obedience, not applause. Sowing, not harvesting. Isaiah reminded himself again and again, he wasn't sent to fix hearts. He was sent to speak truth to them. Still, he longed to be heard. The first time he spoke publicly, it was in the outer court of the temple. A small crowd had gathered, mostly curious onlookers, a few elders and some who recognized him by name. He stood beneath the colonnade, scroll in hand, breath shallow in his chest. He didn't shout. He didn't perform. He simply read the words, slow, steady, unwavering. A warning of what was to come, of how far they had fallen, of the fire that would not be withheld forever. When he finished, silence met him. No applause. No outrage, just blank faces. A few people shuffled away. Some exchanged glances. One man scoffed and muttered something under his breath. Only one young woman remained for a moment longer than the rest. She didn't speak, but she didn't look away. Then she turned and disappeared into the crowd. Isaiah stood alone. He rolled up the scroll and pressed it to his chest. This was what it meant to be sent, not for crowds, not for glory, but for truth. He continued his work, day by day, speaking. Writing, whispering warnings into the wind if that was all he could do. He spoke in the streets, in the temple, in quiet corners of the city, and though few listened, he did not stop. Each word he spoke felt like another seed dropped into dry ground, and when the doubts crept back in, as they often did, he remembered the oak and the terebinth, the stumps that remained even after fire, the holy seed buried in what looked like death. He clung to that image, not a tree in full bloom, not fruit on the vine, just a stump, but alive, and enough. One evening, as Isaiah crossed the city toward home, he passed a group of children playing near a ruined wall. They had drawn something in the dust, figures and symbols, shapes of animals and people. One boy looked up and waved. "Are you the man who speaks about fire and kings?" he asked. Isaiah paused. "I am," he said. The boy nodded. "My mother says you're strange." Isaiah smiled, just faintly. "She's probably right." "But I listened," the boy added, his voice quieter, "to what you said at the temple about light coming after the darkness." Isaiah's breath caught for a moment. He knelt beside the boy. "Do you believe it?" The child shrugged. "I don't know, but I remember it." And then he ran off with the others, laughing. Isaiah stood slowly, the faintest warmth blooming in his chest. It wasn't understanding, it wasn't transformation, but it was remembrance. A seed. And perhaps, for now, that was enough. Years passed. The city changed, slowly then suddenly. Kings came and went. Some feared the Lord, most did not. Isaiah watched as the hearts of the people hardened like sun-baked clay. Injustice deepened. Idolatry spread like rot through the streets. The warnings he had once whispered now echoed louder, more urgent, and still they were met with indifference, scorn, or silence. But he kept speaking. Through mockery, through loneliness, through days when his own faith flickered low, he spoke. Because the voice that had once thundered from the throne of heaven still stirred quietly within him. It no longer needed to shout. It lived in him now. Sometimes Isaiah would walk by the old vineyard outside the city. It remained dry, lifeless, just stones and brittle vines. Yet each time he passed, he looked for a single green shoot, some sign of return, not because he expected it, but because he believed it would come. One day. He wrote of hope, even when it felt distant. He prophesied not just judgment, but redemption, a shoot from the stump of Jesse, a child born, a light dawning in the land of deep darkness, words that seemed impossible in the present, but that clung to his spirit like stars in a moonless sky. Sometimes he would remember the coal, the heat that never burned, the mercy that didn't destroy. He would press his lips together, as if to remind himself that they had been touched by something holy, and that holy things do not return to silence. One morning he awoke before sunrise. The city was still. Only the soft sounds of early life stirred. A bird's cry, a door creaking open, sandals brushing stone. He stepped outside, the air cool and clean, and climbed to the rooftop where it had all begun. Jerusalem stretched before him, asleep beneath a gold-washed sky. He closed his eyes and listened, not for thunder, not for angels, but for the voice that had become part of him. It was there, not in words, but in presence, in every breath, in every word he would speak today, and tomorrow, and for as long as breath remained in his lungs. He placed a hand over his heart. "I'm still here," he whispered. "Still sent." He didn't know who would listen. He didn't know when the seeds would bloom. But he had seen the Lord, and once a soul has seen glory, it cannot go back to silence. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. Isaiah 6:3.